There are battles that nobody sees. Maybe they don't even leave scars, and at least not the kind you can see. They make no noise, and yet they can exhaust you more than anything else because they happen here, in silence, inside ourselves. There are conversations that we repeat over and over again. Conversations about mistakes, about the words we said, about decisions, or things that should never have happened. And there comes a moment when you no longer know whether you are trying to understand what happened or whether you are simply punishing yourself for it. Because we can become our own harshest judges. We criticize ourselves. We blame ourselves. Sometimes we even speak to ourselves in ways we would never speak to someone we love. And while that conversation continues, life goes on. People keep moving forward. Days continue to pass. The world simply doesn't stop. And very often, the hardest battle is not accepting what we have done. It is not even understanding the consequences. The hardest battle is learning to live with the person we became after all of it. In the previous episode, we talked about the value of our story, about how every experience, even the painful ones, becomes part of who we are. And I remember saying that there was one subject still left to talk about, one subject that deserved an entire episode, because accepting our story is only the beginning. What comes next is far more complicated, something that doesn't happen overnight, something that can take years, which is learning to forgive ourselves. Not so that other people will forgive us afterward, not to erase the past, and certainly not to pretend that nothing happened, but to find something that at times feels impossible: peace. Because perhaps the hardest forgiveness of all is exactly that one, the forgiveness we must learn to give ourselves. Welcome to Sin Manual, No Playbook, a space where there are no perfect formulas and no step by step paths. Here, we talk about life as it is, with doubts, with mistakes, with moments of clarity, and others where we are in the middle just trying to understand what's next. This isn't a podcast to tell you what to do, it's a space to question, to feel, and maybe find your own answers, because at the end, no one gave us a manual, and still, we keep moving forward. Okay, now we can begin. So, in the previous episode, we talked about the value of our story. And in fact, I told you that I wanted to dedicate an entire episode to this subject. Because accepting our story, as difficult as that already is not always the hardest part. Sometimes the truly difficult part begins afterward. Because there comes a moment when you stop asking yourself what happened and start asking something much more uncomfortable. What do I do now with all of this? What do I do with the decisions I made? What do I do with the people I hurt? What do I do with the consequences? What do I do with myself? And I want to make something clear from the very beginning, because this is important. Talking about forgiving ourselves doesn't mean ignoring the pain we caused. It doesn't mean minimizing our mistakes. It doesn't mean erasing the consequences. Because every decision leaves a mark. Every action carries weight. And understanding that is also part of the process. But we also can't spend the rest of our lives punishing ourselves over and over again for things that have already happened. Because if we are honest, I think we all share a very human tendency, the tendency to look for explanations outside ourselves. We blame the people around us. We blame circumstances. We blame bad luck. We blame the stage of life where we were going through. And of course, there are deeply unfair situations. There are wounds we didn't choose. There are burdens that do not belong to us. But there are also moments when we use all of that to avoid taking responsibility for our own choices. Because it is much easier to point outside than to look inside. And accepting that hurts. And it hurts a lot. It hurts to realize that some of the wounds we carry also bear our signature. Because recognizing our mistakes is one thing, but accepting that they had real consequences is something entirely different. And that is when the difficult questions begin. The questions we spend years trying to avoid. Is there any situation in your life that is the consequence of your own actions, but for a long time you prefer to blame on bad luck, on other people, or simply on circumstances? Because I think that this is where the journey truly begins. Not when we stop suffering, not when we stop crying. It begins when we find the courage to sit in front of our own story and say, yes, there were things beyond my control, but there were also things that depended on me. And accepting that, as painful as it may be, is the first step toward finding peace. And once you accept that, once you stop looking only outward, you come face to face with something much more difficult. Because in the end, the battle was not against circumstances. It was not against other people. It was not against the past. The battle was against myself. And more specifically, against my own ego. Because here there's something interesting about the ego. It rarely looks the way we imagine it. It is not always arrogance, it's not always feeling superior. Sometimes ego disguises itself as things that seem like virtues. It disguises itself as strength, as intelligence, as experience, as perfectionism. In my case, my ego wore many different masks. I was the perfectionist, the organized one, the one who always needed to have the last word, the one who always had an explanation for everything. And above all, the one who was convinced that he was very smart and that somehow he could always find a way out. For a long time, that made me believe that I didn't need help, that I could solve everything on my own, that nobody would understand what was happening inside my head. But the truth was very different. Yes, many people tried to help me. People who called me, who wrote to me, who reached out and offered a hand. And yet, many times I refused that help. Sometimes because of pride, because of ego. But other times, because deep down I felt that I didn't deserve it. As if there were a part of me that still believed that I had to keep paying for my mistakes. And I think that is where something appears that we rarely talk about. We are our own harshest judges because nobody speaks to us as harshly as we speak to ourselves. Nobody reminds us of our failures as often as we do. How many times have we hurt ourselves with our own words? How many times have we blamed ourselves for things that happened years ago? How many times have we reopened old wounds just to make sure that they still hurt? Because there are conversations that nobody hears, but they happen every single day inside us. Conversations filled with blame, with guilt, with shame, and sometimes even with hatred toward ourselves. And the most dangerous thing of all is that ego always finds a way to protect itself. It convinces us that the problem is outside of us, that bad luck is to blame, that other people failed us, that the world has been unfair to us. And of course, many times life is unfair. But there comes a moment when we have to sit in front of the mirror and ask ourselves an uncomfortable question. What part of all of this was the consequence of my own decisions? Because answering that question requires something much more difficult than intelligence, much more difficult than pride. It requires humility, and above all, it requires courage. And after that conversation, after accepting that I could no longer hide behind circumstances or behind my own ego, a very difficult part began. Because understanding what happened doesn't mean that you have healed. In fact, I think healing begins exactly there. When we stop asking only what we did and begin to ask ourselves why we did it. Why did I react that way? Why did I feel the need to prove so much? Why was it so difficult for me to accept help? Or why did I keep making the same mistakes over and over again? Not to feel guilty, but to find the reason. And answering those questions was not easy, because many times we discover things about ourselves that we don't like, parts of our personality that we would rather ignore, wounds we have hidden for years, or fears that we learn to kind of disappear. In my case, the process was about accepting my story, understanding the consequences of my actions, identifying what had led me to make certain decisions, and beginning to remove from my path the things that were keeping me from moving forward. because there is something important that I learned. Change doesn't happen simply when we leave behind a bad habit or when we give up something we think we need. Real change happens when we understand why we needed those things in the first place. Because if we never understand the origin, we run the risk of repeating the same story with different names in different places. And there is something important that I want to say here. I cannot even imagine the battles that other people have had to fight. In fact, very likely, many have gone through things that far more difficult than I have, far more painful, far more complex. But I don't believe that our strength is measured by the severity of the battles we face. I believe our strength is measured by our ability to understand them, by the courage to sit in front of them. And if they were the consequence of our own actions, by our willingness to do the work required to move forward. Because this is not about doing everything perfectly. In fact, one of the things that I had to accept was understanding that I could fail again, that I am still human, that I still have weaknesses, that there are still good days and bad days. And accepting that didn't make me feel weaker. I felt free because I stopped demanding perfection from myself and started demanding awareness. I understood that life is not about walking without ever stumbling. It is about understanding every step we take, learning from it, and never stopping the process of getting to know ourselves. Because perhaps true forgiveness doesn't begin when we stop suffering. Perhaps it begins when we finally understand who we are. And after all of that, after accepting my story, understanding a little better who I was, after beginning to face my wounds, there was something else that proved incredibly difficult to accept. Because we tend to believe that the process ends the moment we understand what happened, but it doesn't. There comes a moment when you have to learn how to live again. And that can be even much harder than it sounds. I don't know if you have heard this song from Duran Duran. It's called Ordinary World. It says something like, I won't cry for yesterday because there's an ordinary world somehow I have to find. And as I try to make my way to the ordinary world, I will learn to survive. I think that describes this process perfectly. While we remain trapped inside our thoughts, life keeps moving. People continue making plans, friends continue meeting, families continue growing, the days continue to pass. Not because the world is cruel, not because it is indifferent, simply because life doesn't stop. And for a long time, I was still living inside conversations that had already ended. I kept fighting with myself. I kept searching for impossible answers. I kept imagining different outcomes, as if thinking about it one more time will somehow change what had already happened. But there comes a point when you become tired of fighting yourself, tired of blaming yourself, tired of returning again and again to the same place. And then you understand something important. Peace doesn't come when you finally find all the answers. It doesn't come when you manage to justify what happened. It doesn't come when you erase the past, which is impossible. It appears when you accept that there are things you can no longer change. And when you decide that you no longer want to live trapped there. Because there comes a moment when continuing to punish yourself helps no one. It doesn't repair the damage. It doesn't change the story. It only prevents you from living the present. And that was when I understood something I had never understood before. It is not about doing everything perfectly. It is not about never making another mistake. It is about living with greater awareness, about understanding who you are, about recognizing your limits, and about accepting that even while the world keeps turning, there's still time to find your place within it. Because in the end, all of us are trying to do the same thing. All of us are trying to find our own ordinary world. And it was right there that something began to happen that I had never planned for. Because if I am completely honest, I never started this journey thinking about forgiving myself. I never sat down one day and said, hey, I'm going to learn how to be at peace with myself. None of that. All I wanted was to understand what had happened, to understand why I had made certain decisions, to understand why I had fought so hard against myself. And without even realizing it, forgiveness began to appear. Not as a decision, not as a goal, but as a consequence. Because there comes a moment when you truly begin to know yourself. You begin to recognize your strengths, but also your weaknesses. You begin to understand your fears, your wounds, your contradictions. And you discover something unexpected. That in the end, you were not fighting against a bad person. You were not fighting against an enemy. You were just fighting against someone deeply human. Someone who made mistakes. Someone who made poor decisions. Someone who hurt others and was hurt in return. Someone who believed he had all the answers and eventually discovered that he was only beginning to understand himself. And I don't know where you are on your own journey. I don't know what conversations you still have when nobody's listening. I don't know which decisions you keep replaying in your mind before you fall asleep. Maybe there is something in your past that still doesn't allow you to look at yourself in the mirror with peace. Maybe you are still convinced that you should have done things differently. Maybe you are still waiting for the perfect moment to finally make peace with yourself. But if there's one thing I have learned through all of this, it is that the perfect moment will probably never arrive. What does arrive, if we are willing to do the work, is a different feeling. An ordinary morning while you are driving, while you are walking, while you are having a cup of coffee, and suddenly you realize that you still remember what happened, that the consequences are still there, that there are still things you regret, but you also realize that you are no longer fighting yourself. And perhaps that is the true meaning of forgiveness. Not forgetting, not justifying, not erasing your story, but learning to live with it without punishing yourself every single day for the same reason. Because maybe the greatest act of courage is not proving something to the world. Maybe the greatest act of courage is sitting in front of the mirror, looking at your entire story with all the good and all the bad, and finally making peace with the person you see on the other side. At the beginning of this episode, I told you that there are battles that nobody sees. And I still believe that is true. Because the hardest fight often doesn't happen with other people. It doesn't happen during an argument. It doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens here, inside us, in silence, when we are left alone with our thoughts, with our mistakes, with the decisions we made, and the consequences they left behind. And if there is one thing I have learned throughout this process, it is that forgiving yourself is not a moment. It is not a sentence. And it certainly is not forgetting what happened. It is a journey, a long journey, an uncomfortable one, and at times a painful one. A journey in which you accept your story. You understand the consequences of your actions. You recognize your ego. You learn to ask for help. You understand that you are human. And you discover that you don't need to be perfect in order to live in peace. You only need to be honest enough to continue getting to know yourself. I don't know what story you carry with you. I don't know what conversations you still have when nobody's listening. I don't know which decisions you continue to replay in your mind. But I want to leave you with one final question. A question that you may not be able to answer today, and that is okay. If you were able to treat yourself with the same compassion that you show to the people you love, what will change in your life? Maybe the hardest forgiveness is not the one we hope to receive from others. Maybe it is the one we have been denying ourselves for years. And perhaps the day we truly understand that, we will discover that real peace was never about changing our story, but about learning how to live with it. Because in the end, we are all doing the same thing. We are all trying to understand ourselves a little better. We are learning to live with our light and with our shadows. And all of us, in one way or another, are searching for a little peace. So, if you made it this far, thank you. Thank you for giving me a few minutes of your time. But most important, thank you for giving a few minutes to yourself. I will see you in the next episode, and remember, everything is going to be okay.